3,240 people were killed. 34,000 were tortured. 70,000 were imprisoned without warrant. Between $5 and $10 billion were stolen from one of Asia's poorest countries. His wife had 3,000 pairs of shoes. His name was Ferdinand Marcos. He ruled the Philippines for 21 years. He died in exile in Hawaii in 1989, having never faced trial for a single one of the crimes committed under his government. In 2016, the Philippine government gave him a hero's burial with full military honors. In 2022, his son, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., known as Bongbong, won the Philippine presidential election with 58% of the vote, the largest presidential mandate in Philippine history since his father's era. Marcos Jr. won partly because a generation of Filipinos had grown up without being taught what his father did. The history had been rewritten. On TikTok, this is the story of how a dictatorship erased its own crimes, and then put its son in charge of the country it had looted. Ferdinand Marcos was born in 1917 in Sarat, Ilocos Norte, in the northern Philippines. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him in his early career, brilliant. He passed the Philippine bar exam with the highest score in history. He was a gifted lawyer, a compelling speaker, and a political tactician of considerable skill. He was also a fabricator. The political career that brought Marcos to the presidency in 1965 was built substantially on a wartime record that investigators would later find to be largely invented. Marcos claimed to have led a guerrilla unit called Ang Mga Maharlika during the Japanese occupation, to have been awarded dozens of American and Philippine military decorations, and to have been one of the most decorated Filipino soldiers of the Second World War. American military records examined after the war by U.S. Army historians found that many of Marcos's claimed decorations were fabricated or fraudulently obtained. The guerrilla unit he claimed to have commanded was assessed as having no legitimate military record. He was elected president anyway, in 1965. He was re-elected in 1969 in an election widely described as fraudulent. Under the Philippine Constitution he had sworn to uphold, he could not run for a third term. His solution was to abolish the Constitution. On September 21, 1972, Marcos signed Proclamation 1081 placing the entire Philippines under martial law. His stated justification was a communist insurgency and a series of bombings in Manila. The bombings, investigations would later suggest, had been orchestrated by Marcos's own allies, specifically, Defense Secretary Juan Ponce Enrile, who would later admit that the assassination attempt on him that Marcos cited as evidence of the communist threat had been staged. The proclamation dissolved Congress. It suspended the writ of habeas corpus. It shut down 464 media outlets, newspapers, television stations, radio stations, overnight. It placed all power in the hands of Ferdinand Marcos. On the first night of martial law, 49 people were immediately arrested in the Greater Manila area. First on the list was Senator Benigno Aquino Jr., Marcos's primary political rival. The new society, as Marcos called it, had begun. To understand the Marcos dictatorship, you cannot understand Ferdinand without understanding Imelda. Imelda Romualdez Marcos, whom Ferdinand married in 1954 after an 11-day courtship, was not simply the dictator's wife. She was the co-architect of the kleptocracy. While Ferdinand controlled the military and the political apparatus, Imelda controlled the cultural and social dimensions of the regime, commissioning vast public works projects that served simultaneously as urban development and personal monuments, maintaining the international social networks that gave the Marcoses legitimacy in foreign capitals, and accumulating the personal wealth that would eventually make her name synonymous with the specific excess of authoritarian corruption. The 3,000 pairs of shoes discovered at Malacanang Palace when the Marcoses fled in 1986 were not incidental. They were evidence. Evidence of the specific relationship between a government that had stolen between $5 and $10 billion from one of Asia's poorest countries and the personal lifestyle that the stolen money financed. If this history is new to you, subscribe to Unsolved East and hit like. New episodes every week. The Marcos dictatorship operated as three interlocking systems simultaneously. The first was political control. The military and the police were expanded, funded, and empowered to arrest, detain, torture, and kill perceived opponents of the regime. The targets were not random, they were the specific people most capable of organizing opposition. Labor leaders, student activists, journalists, lawyers, church workers, community organizers. The people who could articulate grievances, build coalitions, and sustain resistance. Amnesty International documented the systematic use of torture in the detention facilities where political prisoners were held. The methods were varied and deliberate: electric shock, water torture, prolonged stress positions, sleep deprivation, and the specific psychological methods designed to break people who might otherwise have the resilience to withstand physical pain. The 34,000 people documented as having been tortured during the martial law period represent the cases that investigators were able to confirm. The actual number is believed to be significantly higher. 3,240 people were killed. The second system was economic control. Marcos transferred ownership of major Philippine industries: sugar, coconut, telecommunications, construction, media, banking, to a network of cronies whose loyalty was rewarded with monopoly rights, government contracts, and the specific protection of a legal system that the dictator controlled entirely. The crony capitalists enriched themselves. A portion of their enrichment flowed back to Marcos and Imelda through the mechanisms that authoritarian kleptocracy has always used: kickbacks, fake foundations, overseas accounts, real estate. The estimated total stolen from the Philippine state and people ranges from $5 to $10 billion. In a country where the majority of the population lived in poverty. The third system was cultural control. Media was state-controlled. The curriculum was rewritten to present Marcos as a national hero. The specific history of the period before martial law, the democratic institutions, the free press, the political opposition, was systematically reframed as chaos that only Marcos's new society had been able to tame. The rewriting of history was not incidental to the dictatorship. It was essential to it. On August 21, 1983, Benigno Aquino Jr. returned to the Philippines. He had been imprisoned by Marcos for 8 years and had then gone into exile in the United States for medical treatment. He returned knowing the risk. His friends had begged him not to go. He had told them, "The Filipino is worth dying for." He was shot on the tarmac of Manila International Airport as he descended from the plane, surrounded by military escorts. He was killed before he reached the ground. The assassination of Marcos's most prominent political opponent, in full view of witnesses, caught on camera, conducted by the military that Marcos controlled, was a turning point. The specific brazenness of the killing, the decision to murder a returning political exile in front of cameras at an international airport, communicated something about the regime's confidence in its own impunity that proved to be miscalculation. The Philippine middle class, which had tolerated or accommodated the Marcos government for over a decade, began to turn. The economic crisis of the early 1980s, combined with the Aquino assassination, produced a political environment in which even Marcos's traditional support base was eroding. In February 1986, Marcos called a snap election. He declared himself the winner. The Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines declared the election fraudulent. 4 million people took to the streets of Manila on EDSA Highway. The People Power Revolution had begun. The People Power Revolution of February 1986 was extraordinary. 4 million unarmed civilians, students, housewives, priests, nuns, ordinary Filipinos, stood between the Marcos military and the rebel soldiers who had turned against the regime. Cardinal Jaime Sin called on Filipinos to go to EDSA. They went. The soldiers who had been ordered to fire on the crowds did not fire. Marcos fled to Hawaii on February 25, 1986. He took with him his family, his associates, and, according to customs declarations and subsequent investigations, 22 crates and 12 suitcases containing jewelry, gold bullion, certificates of deposit, and cash. He died in Honolulu on September 28, 1989. He was never extradited. He was never tried. He was never convicted of a single crime in a court of law. The Philippine government under subsequent administrations pursued the recovery of the stolen assets through civil proceedings. In 2003, the Philippine Supreme Court ruled that $683 million in Swiss bank accounts was ill-gotten wealth. Some assets were recovered. Most were not. In 2016, President Rodrigo Duterte, elected on a platform of law and order and drug war, authorized the burial of Ferdinand Marcos at the Libingan ng Mga Bayani, the Heroes Cemetery in Manila. Full military honors. The Supreme Court upheld the burial. The survivors of the torture chambers, the families of the 3,240 killed, the political prisoners who had spent years in detention, they protested. The burial happened anyway. And then came the TikTok campaign. In the years leading up to the 2022 election, a coordinated social media operation, documented by researchers at Oxford University and the University of the Philippines, spread content across TikTok, Facebook, and YouTube, systematically reframing the Marcos era as a golden age of Philippine prosperity. The videos emphasized economic growth statistics from the early Marcos years, real, but separated from their context of debt, corruption, and the economic collapse of the 1980s. They portrayed Imelda Marcos as a fashion icon. They showed Ferdinand Marcos as a visionary leader. They reached the generation that had not lived through martial law. They worked. In the May 2022 presidential election, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Bongbong, won with 58.77% of the vote. The largest presidential mandate in Philippine history since his father's era. He did not campaign on his father's legacy. He didn't need to. The TikTok had already done the work. The survivors of the Marcos martial law period are in their 70s and 80s. The people who were arrested in the first night of martial law on September 21, 1972, who were tortured in the detention facilities that Amnesty International documented, who spent years in prison for the crime of organizing a union or writing a newspaper article or teaching their students that the government had failed them. These people have lived for more than 50 years in a country that has never fully reckoned with what was done to them. The stolen money. Estimates of what the Marcos family stole from the Philippines range from $5 to $10 billion. Some has been recovered through civil proceedings. More has not. The Marcos family, which retained significant assets despite the post-1986 recovery efforts, continues to be one of the wealthiest political families in the Philippines. The son of the man who stole the money is president. The woman who had 3,000 pairs of shoes, Imelda Marcos, now in her 90s, was convicted of corruption in Philippine courts in 2018 and sentenced to prison. She has not served a single day. She attends public events. She gives interviews. She says the Marcos era was a golden age. The torture chambers are documented. The 3,240 deaths are documented. The $10 billion is documented. The 34,000 who were tortured are documented. The son is president. The shoes are in a museum. The history is on TikTok. And the survivors are still waiting for the specific words, the formal accountability, the full recovery of the stolen assets, the criminal convictions that would attach consequences to what was done, that have not come in 50 years and that the current political configuration of the Philippines does not suggest are coming soon. The Filipino is worth dying for. Aquino said it. He was killed for it. His killer's son is president.